Protein Day here on the Exam Room Podcast, brought to you by the Physicians Committee. Hi, I am the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. We're going to be talking about two different kinds of protein that comes from animal sources, meat, dairy, things like that. And then we're going to be talking about plant protein. A lot of people say, hey, if you're getting your protein from plants, either you're not getting protein at all or you're just not getting protein that's high quality enough. Well, my guest today is going to break it all down for us. He is a friend of the show, a phenomenal human being, and he's going to be speaking at the Planted Expo, not just in Toronto here at the end of April, but also in Vancouver the following month. With that, we welcome Dr. Matthew Nagra back to the exam room. My friend, thanks for doing a little Protein 101 for us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and definitely a topic I love talking about, so no problem at all.
First question is one that I hope will clear up a lot of this confusion out there. And that is, does the body actually absorb these traditional, I'll call them that, protein sources, meat, cheese, things like that, differently than they do from plant protein that you would get from nuts, seeds, and basically every other food?
Yeah, so I mean, you hit on one of the big concerns that's often raised, especially in the fitness community around plant proteins, and that is this idea of bioavailability, sort of the proportions of the protein that we actually absorb. And with the animal protein sources, you're typically absorbing somewhere in the mid 80s to mid 90s as far as a percentage. With plant protein, it is maybe a little bit more variable. And there are studies suggesting that that absorption could actually be significantly lower, but there are some problems with those studies. For one, the scoring systems that are typically used, called the PDCAS and the DAS for short, for anybody who's interested, what they do is they feed these protein sources to animals typically, and they measure how much protein comes out the other end or how much is absorbed by the end of the small intestine. And you'll find that, yeah, it's a bit less typically with the plant protein sources, but they often feed raw foods, especially when they're doing it with pigs. So they'll feed raw legumes, raw grains, etc., and they're less digestible in their raw state, and we don't eat them in their raw state typically, as far as the grains and legumes anyway. The other big issue is plant proteins. They contain varying amounts of the amino acids. These are the building blocks of proteins. With animal foods, you have a pretty consistent, say, balance of amino acids. With plant foods, while all plants contain all of the amino acids or the essential amino acids, they can have more or less of certain types. And what those studies do is they pick out the least prevalent amino acid and they score the protein based on that. So not only are they looking at the digestibility differences oftentimes with raw foods, which is unfavorable towards the plant protein sources, but they'll actually pick out the amino acid that is least prevalent and score the food based on that. Now, we have some human data looking at digestibility of a variety of protein sources, wheat protein sources, soy protein sources, and looking at the total protein digestibility rather than honing in on those individual amino acids. And you see that the difference between the plant protein sources and the animal protein sources is maybe a few percent. It's nothing to really get concerned about. If you were really concerned about it, you just eat slightly more protein, and that's it. But even then, it's not very convincing that it's a problem at all.
I know that with certain nutrients like iron, if I believe if you eat vitamin C with that, it helps the body absorb it a little bit better. Could that also be the case when it comes to plant protein? Are there some other nutrients that you might want to mix in there to really optimize that absorption?
There may be, but I would say they aren't going to be major contributors. The big one is going to be, yes, proper preparation, so cooking. Actually, removing some of the fiber, interestingly, can increase protein absorption too. That's why things like tofu, where some of the fiber is actually removed and is a little bit more concentrated protein source, can be beneficial as well. But I wouldn't say you need to hyper focus on adding certain things to it.
Vice versa, is there anything that could block, other than eating it in its raw form, block the protein absorption?
Again, the high fiber content legumes possibly a little bit less, but it's not going to be um, earth shattering as far as the numbers we're talking about. We actually have some data on cooked legumes. Like I said, they often feed the raw form, but even with cooked legumes, you're still looking at an absorption in the high 70s to even low 90s as far as a percentage, based on again some of the limited data that we have. So yeah, a bit less perhaps, but still not a huge difference.
I was talking to I see the Plant Strong T-shirt. I was
Yeah.
talking to Rip Esselstyn not that long ago, and he really made it a point during our conversation to just basically say, "Well, look, if you're getting enough calories, it's virtually impossible not to get an adequate amount of protein, plant protein or not." Is that something that you also subscribe to? Like, are we just too protein obsessed here, and just make sure that you're eating enough and you're good to go?
Yes and no. I think there's sort of two sides to that. There's the side where there is definitely maybe too much of an obsession with protein, and then there's the side where its importance is sort of discounted altogether. And I would say no, it is important. And while we have the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance of zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, so that would be taking your weight in kilograms and just multiplying it by zero point 0.8. That's sort of the recommended amount, the amount that you need to survive and live and whatnot. But there is research, especially for as we age, suggesting that higher intakes are actually beneficial to help maintain mobility, help maintain bone health, prevent sarcopenia, which is a muscle loss as we age. And that target is typically set around 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, which is not hard to get. But if you're really not focusing on any protein rich plant foods, if you're just eating your grains and fruits and veggies and so on, yeah, you'll probably end up falling short on that target. So I do like to emphasize protein a little bit more, just to make sure that you're hitting those targets. But it's easy enough to do with things like tofu, seitan, tempeh, etc.
Would you say that those are really kind of the best plant-based protein sources out there? What are some when you're working with a patient that you would recommend?
Yeah, I love. I mean, there's so many different types of soy. Of course, there's the tofu, there's the tempeh, there's the soy curls. I don't know if you have that over there, but I just bought a huge case of them. I love those. Textured vegetable protein as well, or textured soy protein. And then there's seitan being a similar sort of idea. And then one that is, I feel like is becoming more common now to see is actually legume-based pastas. So using like a lentil pasta, chickpea pasta, I absolutely love using those and recommending those to people because it's such a sort of sneaky way to get a whole bunch of protein in, and they're very fiber rich. They're loaded with iron and other minerals as well. So definitely ways to fit those in, and I'd say those are some of my favorites.
Where do you weigh in on the idea of protein powders? I guess especially amongst the athletes who are looking for that little bit of an extra boost. Is that something that athletes should be looking at? And at what point should somebody you were just talking about as we get a little bit older may need some more protein in their diet? Should they then be looking at maybe supplementing a little bit with that?
Yeah, I actually am definitely a fan of using protein powders to help hit whatever target you're aiming for. So if it is just more for the general health longevity aspect around the 1.2 gram per kilogram mark, if you're having trouble hitting that, then yeah, a protein powder is a really easy, convenient way to fit that in. For an athlete who might be aiming higher, so for let's say strength or hypertrophy, so muscle gaining, you're looking at about 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That's double the RDA. And while possible with just foods, is certainly a little bit more difficult and would take a little bit more planning. A protein powder can fit in there really well and be an easy way to bump up that intake. Let's say you typically make a smoothie, soy milk, you got hemp seeds, your fruits, veggies, etc. Maybe you're hitting about 15 grams. Well, you can bump it up to 35, 40 grams by adding a bit of protein powder. So it's definitely really convenient, and I do like using it to help hit those targets when they just can't be really met otherwise.
Is there a concern at some point with having too much protein in the diet? At some point, it goes from being this nutrient that we need and the body really loves to build those healthy muscles to being, whoa, you got too much of it now, Jack, and you're in trouble.
So there are some concerns that are often raised around that, and there's kind of two main things that are looked at. For one, it's the type of protein. So even with high intakes of plant protein, we don't see a higher risk of, say, cardiovascular outcomes, kidney disease, etc. We actually see, if anything, it seems to be beneficial. Now, cases where we might want to moderate protein intake is perhaps in chronic kidney disease, and that's obviously something that one would work with their nephrologist on, as far as how much they're able to consume. And I'd say there's a little bit of debate around even that aspect. But when it comes to plant protein specifically, I wouldn't say there's really a harm to say going too high. I mean, you're never really going to get uh, crazy high unless you're just having a sort of protein powder TVP sort of diet. I can't imagine you getting even above like 2.5 grams per kilogram if you're having a pretty well-rounded um, plant-based diet. Yeah, I really wouldn't have concerns. Higher plant protein intake is typically associated with better health outcomes than low protein intakes.
And let's talk about that low protein intake. How would somebody know? What are some of the symptoms that they might experience if they are coming up short in that area?
So let's say you're sitting in that typical zero point 0.8 to 1 gram mark, which is adequate, but maybe not optimal. You're not going to notice much as far as symptoms. Maybe you have a little bit more difficulty putting on uh, muscle mass compared to your peers, perhaps, but I mean, there's so many other variables there. It's really hard to pinpoint that. That's more something that would come from tracking your intake and then looking at how much you're actually consuming. Now, if you're really falling short, let's say you're at zero point 0.6 or something, I mean, you can notice muscle wasting. If you're really, really short, as we see in a lot of impoverished nations, you can have sort of a bloating that can occur, or water retention, and that's a sign of kwashiorkor. So it's a actual protein deficiency. But yeah, otherwise you're not going to have these sorts of symptoms. That's why it's really important to just get ahead of it and really track your intake, and so you can help promote that longevity, the mobility, etc.
And let's say somebody has been coming up short, maybe they just switched over to the plant-based diet and they're still in that kind of feeling out period or whatever diet, like even just coming up short for whatever reason. If they then increase the amount of protein that they're taking in, I can that then kind of, eh, offset the damage that may have done? Like, will that muscle wasting suddenly go away? You can start building healthy muscles again?
So yes and no. One aspect there that is really important is the resistance training. There was actually a really nice review that came out last year. Tagawa was the author on that, and they looked at protein intake and muscle mass, actually, sorry, strength. I believe in that one. And they looked at the impact of protein in a context of no resistance training as well as in the context of resistance training. And in the context of no resistance training, just upping protein intake had very little effect on actual muscle and strength gains. But in the context of resistance training, that's where you see the benefits up to about 1.5 or so grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And so yes, you can help build back some of that muscle and certainly prevent worsening of that muscle loss by adding in the protein. But a huge component there is going to be actually stressing your muscles, and that's I think one of the big takeaways here is there's this debate as we just kind of mentioned around protein as a whole. But within that debate, I mean, I think we can all agree that the resistance training, or at least we should be able to agree that the resistance training is the most important factor.
And let's look at this then a step further. So we know that when it comes to certain chronic conditions, you can reverse them. Diet and exercise, a huge component there, but it is reversible. So let's say somebody does then begin getting that adequate amount of protein, does add that resistance training, even if, I mean, they just turned into, a stick figure and they really had a lot of muscle wasting. Can you fire those things back up with the right amount of resistance training, with the right amount of protein, and get your health back on track?
Yeah, that's going to be the key to doing it is just eating enough protein, also eating enough calories, right? If we're talking about a case where someone has lost a lot of weight, perhaps, then yeah, the calories are going to be a huge component as well. And then you add the resistance training in, and you can get some of that muscle back.
Yeah, I love that. I love the rebound thing, right? Because I feel like in this space, there are a lot of times when people just feel hopeless. And the thing that I love when I have guests like you on the show is being able to help paint that picture for them that, I mean, 9 times out of 10, if not more, hope is never completely lost. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's good that we're talking about this topic too because I'm just sort of a little bit of a tangent here, but just thought of it. One of the things I find, especially in elderly populations, is that there is actually a big lack of resistance training. So it's good to have that reminder that Yeah, I mean, the walking, any sort of say cardiovascular or aerobic type activities that you're doing are great, but combining that with some resistance training, even a couple times a week or so, it can make huge dividends for your health.
How quickly, and I mean, I hate to put you on the spot here, but I mean, this is a question that also comes up. It's like, yeah, I'll make these changes, but how quickly might I begin to see or experience these results? So, say somebody goes from being a sedentary couch potato, completely not taking care of themselves nutritionally, to really implementing the things you and I are talking about now. How quickly might they begin to see some gains in that area?
It's hard to give an exact number, but what I can say is a lot of the trials that we have on protein intake are, anywhere, or say protein intake and resistance training are anywhere from maybe 8 weeks to 12 weeks. I mean, there are longer ones, there are some shorter ones, but usually in that window, we do see significant improvements. And the amount of improvement is obviously going to depend on the amount and frequency and volume of resistance training. So hard to give an exact number, but I would expect to see results pretty quickly. And usually, right in the beginning, even in that first few weeks or month, you have a lot of you'll build a lot of strength just based on nerve functioning. So it's the way that your nerves fire, and it's sort of that muscle memory kind of idea. Not that it's the most accurate term here, but it's not actually necessarily due to building muscle at that point. It's more just your nerves firing at a better rate and getting used to the movements, and so you tend to progress pretty quickly in those early times.
I want to ask you about a muscle building study that you talked about on Instagram pretty recently. But before we do that, I also want to ask you about the notion of not getting enough complete proteins while eating a plant based diet. This, too, is something that has come up time and again. And for whatever reason, I guess the messaging there just isn't quite connecting with a lot of people. So, when it comes to making sure that you're getting a complete protein makeup, how does one do that eating a plant based diet?
Yeah, so for starters, the idea of or let's go with the scientific definition of a complete or incomplete protein. An incomplete protein would be one that is lacking at least one of the essential amino acids, meaning it doesn't have it. Now, all plants, every single plant, contains all of the essential amino acids. There is not a plant that does not contain all of them. In fact, the only protein I'm aware of that is lacking one of the essential amino acids is collagen, and that's it's an animal protein, so it's kind of ironic. So that's not a problem. Now, where there can be concerns is that, as I mentioned earlier, plants contain varying amounts of the different amino acids. So they might be really high in certain amino acids, lower in others, but they complement each other. So if in your diet you're having grains, you're having legumes, you're having nuts and seeds, etc., it all adds up and it'll essentially balance out, and you'll hit enough of the amino acids that you need. I don't think you need to focus too much on that as long as you have a bit of variety in your diet. The other thing is just by eating more protein, you can help meet the thresholds or requirements for the individual amino acids as well. So by aiming for those higher targets, that also adds in a bit of a safety net and helps get you there. It's really this idea of incomplete proteins, and that is just it's so outdated at this point, but it is something that I still see all the time online, and it's really a telltale sign that maybe someone hasn't done their reading on the topic.
Yeah, the variety in the diet thing is interesting. I think that a lot of times people think, well, one of the things that we stress anyway is like eat the rainbow, eat a wide variety of colors. That means that you're getting basically everything that you need, every nutrient, because every colors. Anyway, I think it can kind of be overwhelming when you're introducing that concept to somebody for the first time to think that, well, every single time they sit down to eat, their plate has to look like, a bag of Skittles or a 64 box of Crayola crowns. It's just like, how does one really make sure that they are getting a wide variety of nutrients in their diet without getting absolutely neurotic about it either?
Yeah, so that's actually a great point you just brought up. It's not about combining at each meal. You don't have to worry about that. What I mean by variety is just in your whole day. If you have oatmeal for breakfast, that's primarily grain. Maybe you throw in some nuts or whatever, and then you have I don't know a tofu dish or something for lunch, and then you have lentils for dinner or whatever. All that stuff is going to combine. You don't have to focus on making each meal the rainbow, so to speak. At the same time, there are some foods that are really well balanced in their amino acid profiles, like soy, actually. I just mentioned tofu is one that's pretty well balanced. So can be more comparable to, say, an animal protein source too. But again, if you're getting enough protein as a whole, and specifically aiming for those higher targets I mentioned earlier, you really don't have to worry about it too much. I would focus more on the amount of protein versus combining and all of that, because that should just happen naturally as long as you're not eating a very monotonous diet of like one or two things in your whole
All right, so back to the Plant Strong t-shirt that you're wearing
day.
right now. It popped into my mind. I wanted to ask you about this study that you had posted about on Instagram that looked at muscle growth among people eating a vegan diet versus those that are eating the omnivorous diet. You had a lot of fun talking about this one. There was a lot of data packed into this study. Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, and actually, before even getting into that one, there was one study that was published about a year and a half prior, 2 years prior, where they took vegans, omnivores, they had them increase their protein intake to that 1.6 gram per kilogram mark, which is ideal for strength and hypertrophy, as I mentioned earlier. And they had them train twice a week for 12 weeks, and ultimately there were no significant differences in muscle and strength outcomes. So that was, the first really good study comparing a strictly plant-based diet to an omnivorous diet, suggesting that yeah, you can get similar sort of muscle and strength gains. Now, this newer study kind of reinforces that idea. So what they did was they took participants. This was, I believe, it was conducted in the UK. I guess that point isn't as important, but they split them into two groups. One of the groups was put on a plant-based diet. Now, I will note it wasn't 100%. They were kind of allowed to have one cheat meal, or one day where they were able to eat some other stuff just to help with compliance as a whole. But by and large, it was a plant-based diet. And then the other group was on an omnivorous diet. Now, the plant group, they actually replaced the meat in the diet with mycoprotein based foods. So mycoprotein, it's actually a derived or a fungus derived protein that's used in a lot of plant based meat alternatives in the UK. I haven't seen it really over here, but definitely know it's a big thing over there. And so they really upped their protein intake with mycoprotein, and they also took a mycoprotein supplement. Whereas the meat eating group, I believe, took a whey protein, or it was a milk protein based supplement. Now they had them also supplement creatine, which has been shown to improve muscle and strength gains as well. So they wanted to really maximize the performance here, and both groups took that. So it's not a difference between the plant-based diet and the omnivorous diet. They had them resistance train 5 times a week, which is quite a bit. And they did that for 2 to 3 months. I actually can't recall the exact timeline there. I think it was 3 months. And at the end of the day, there weren't any significant differences in, again, muscle or strength outcomes. If anything, there was one lift where the vegans actually did, or like I said, they aren't strict vegans. The plant-based eaters were actually performing a little bit better, even, but there was one person who just went through the roof with their performance, so they were kind of pulling the results up. But regardless, there wasn't a detriment. That's the important thing. There was no significant detriment, no sign really of a detriment to the plant-based diet. Both supporting similar gains, using a high-quality plant protein, or technically not plant protein, animal-free protein source in the mycoprotein. And it's just another piece of evidence on top of that previous one, suggesting that, yeah, plant based diets can support these muscle and strength gains. And we can focus on the bioavailability, and we can focus on the amino acid profiles and all that all we want. But if at the end of the day you get the same net result, then who cares? That's all a waste of effort and energy to start debating all those little things when the whole picture shows that you're getting the same sort of result.
Yeah, and a few things I want to unpack here. Number
Yeah.
one, you mentioned fungus protein, and that one is actually kind of new to me. The idea of a fungus specific protein, like that's a big deal over in the UK.
It's been there for a long time. Actually, funny enough, I've been working. Maybe I'll give a little heads up, and maybe I'll be publishing this at some point. But I've been working on a review paper for plant-based meat alternatives and cardiovascular risk factors. And throughout that time, I was looking at some of the research we have on plant-based meat alternatives, and there's some on this mycoprotein going back to the late '80s. It's been around for a while, and
Wow.
so yeah, it's super surprising. And there's some really good trials on it, but not so much in the strength space until maybe the last few years or so. But yeah, it's a big thing over there. It's the product is called corn. Quorn. They're the kind of main company that uses it over there, and they have both vegetarian products, which I think do have some dairy in there, and then they have the strictly plant-based vegan products as well.
Yeah, that's available here in the States as well.
Oh,
I've
it is.
definitely
Okay.
seen it. Yeah, typically in the frozen section. So they'll have things like nuggets, and I think maybe maybe even a corn dog. I don't know. I never really
Okay.
realized what kind of a plant protein that was. I never picked up the package to look at it. That's interesting. Like I was wondering like, well, then how much protein is in the average portobello mushroom? You start talking about fungus. That's where
Yeah.
my mind goes.
Yeah, it's not quite the same thing, but yeah, it's a very concentrated, very protein rich, high quality protein source.
Interesting. Interesting. And then specific to the resistance training that the study participants were doing, did the researchers outline what the workouts actually looked like, or was it just kind of catch as catch can and just do this amount?
No, that's one of the good things about it is it was a structured plan. I can't recall the exact details of that plan off my head, but it was a structured plan, and they were working on progressively adding weight over time, week by week. And with 5 days a week, that's a high volume. That's a pretty solid volume for trying to maximize muscle gains as well. So overall, I really like the structure of the study.
And what kind of resistance training do you do? Are you a push up guy? Are you a free weight guy? What do you do?
I do mostly free weights, squats, bench press, deadlifts, etc. And then I'm a soccer player as well, so uh, do a lot of the cardio in that way.
And what would you recommend to somebody who has not been doing much in terms of resistance training for a very long time? What's the best way that you would tell them to get started?
I mean, if you're looking to get into, say, compound lifts, some of the lifts I just mentioned, I would definitely say working with a trainer is a good idea, at least in the beginning, to get your form down and to kind of understand the movements. But also, if you really haven't done anything, you just want to get started with stressing your muscles a bit. There are a lot of I know fitness YouTube channels and whatnot where they do even body weight or very lightweight stuff just to kind of get started. Wherever you're at, just start there and then you can build up. But definitely, if you're getting into those compound lifts and you don't have any experience with them, I would definitely say working with somebody who has more experience is a good idea.
Eh, uh, Even if somebody's, say, up there in their years a little bit, maybe 70s, 80s, really now hyper focusing on their health, trying to be as healthy as they can into their golden years. I mean, you would still recommend, linking up with a professional and trying to do it
I,
upright.
yeah, I actually think that's a really good idea. And yeah, you might not be getting into squatting 300 pounds at that point, but even just to get familiar with the motions, getting the correct sort of form down, it's I think a good idea. And there are a lot of I know the gym I used to go to over here. There were a lot of classes where they would have them even for specific, say, age groups or specific levels, beginner, intermediate, etc. And they would work with you, and obviously there's a bit of a community there with all the different participants. But I think it is a good idea just generally to get that sort of structure or instruction over it.
Right. And no right or wrong answer here. Also, in the study, you said that there was a little bit of a freedom there. The guys could, or the study participants had a cheat day or a cheat meal,
Mhm.
as it were. As a physician, what is your take on cheat meals? Like, how hard is it? I mean, I just feel like it's so personally, just speaking for me here, doc, it is so counter to what it is that you're trying to do with your health goals. Like, why in the world would you say, I'm going to quit smoking for 10 days, but on the 11th day, I'm going to have a cigarette and I'm going to be a okay? I apply that same philosophy when it comes to cheat meals, but I'm just curious to get your professional opinion. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just always a conversation I like to have.
Yeah, in my practice, I don't really use the term cheat meal or talk about it that way. I find out what are the patient's goals and how can we achieve that, and I always make it really clear that it's on a spectrum. So maybe the further you move this direction up to a point is going to be beneficial, and where you want to sit on that is kind of up to the individual. This idea of cheat meals, as it were, in the study, like I said, was really to help with compliance because they weren't vegans at the beginning, and so just so it's not maybe as big of a change, which is understandable at least from a study design standpoint. But generally speaking, I just don't look at cheat meals as a as cheating, so to speak. I just look at it as like we're gonna kind of set a target for what you're aiming for, and wherever you fall on that spectrum is great, and we can always work on moving further. Afterwards, and I always follow up with patients every 3 weeks or 5 weeks or whatever, to see how the progress is going, and we can go from there. But yeah, I think there's gonna be a lot of different opinions on that topic, for sure.
Yeah, and I come at it with a completely different approach than a lot of people, right? It's just my route that brought me here. That's why I look at things the way that I do. My wife is quick to point out though, she's like, well, it's indulge if you want every once in a while. I was just on the Rock's Instagram and he posts about his cheat meals. And then if you go
Yeah,
and you look at this, holy God,
yeah, yeah. I've
this
seen
guy's
those.
eating like a king's feast, like he has to pan in panoramic mode on his phone just to get all of the food that's on this long table in there. Like it is like, how in the world is this even humanly freaking possible, man?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've seen that.
Yeah.
And like for myself, I think this is a big part of it too, is it's very individual. For myself, when I first made the switch to a plant-based diet, or at least when I first went strictly plant-based, the big reason was I knew personally if I were to allow that wiggle room for myself, then it turns into a bit more wiggle room. And then, it's a bit of a slippery slope, perhaps. For other people, they might be able to manage that a lot better, if they have, again, this goal, and they're able to once in a while sneak things in without necessarily um, falling off, so to speak, if that's the right term here. Then hey, that's okay for them. For myself, it wasn't necessarily in the beginning, and of course now I adhere to a strictly plant-based diet for ethical reasons as well, which makes it way easier. But yeah, I think it's totally individual.
Isn't that interesting how, doing something for somebody or something else makes it easier than it is to do it for yourself? Isn't that weird? Right? Like it's heartwarming in a way, but it's also like, wow, like maybe we should be putting more of a priority on numero uno from time to time. But whatever it takes to get you where it is you need to be, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So here's the deal. We're going to be talking all kinds of protein at the Planted Expo in Toronto, April 29th and 30th. I'm going to be speaking there, not about protein. That's going to be your domain. I assume that you're going to go into a lot more detail when you're up there at where are we having this? We're at the Enercare Center in Toronto. That's a phenomenal place. Holy cow.
Never been, so we'll see.
Yeah. 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 So you're going to get super in depth?
Yeah, I'll get pretty in depth. I mean, I want to make it digestible for everyone, of course, but pun. But anyways, I definitely don't want to miss out on any of the important details. Basically, my goal with the talk is to provide people with the information they need to answer that question that they're going to get about their protein. I want them to be able to drive that point home so hard that the person asking it will never ask them again.
Hey man, nerd out, man. Nerd out and
Yeah.
spread that nutrition knowledge. And then Vancouver at the end of May, Vancouver, May 27th and 28th. You're also going to be at the Planted Expo there. You're a busy guy, my friend. You are a very busy guy.
Yeah, keep him busy. And actually, in Vancouver, I'm gonna be doing a different talk because I gave this one, the protein one, the last time I spoke there. So this time I'm going to be diving into soy, all
Ooh,
the concerns and everything about soy. So it's gonna
that's
be good.
always a hot button issue too, man. That's always a hot button one.
Yeah, I know. I actually, what brought that about was last year or a year and a half ago when I gave the protein talk. One of the big questions at the end, when I had like 1 minute left of Q&A, was about soy, and of course, there's so much to talk about. So planning to address all of it this time.
Outstanding. Very much looking forward to it. Get your tickets right now. Plantedlife.com is the website to go to. We've got a link for you right now in the show description. And also give Dr. Nagra a follow on Instagram. One of my favorite follows at Dr. Matthew Nagra. Dr. Nagra is the place to go. Dude, you have so much great information up there and you present it in such a fun and straightforward manner. You really are just doing tremendous work. So it's been an honor to share some time with you today.
Thanks, and same to you, and look forward to catching up in Toronto there in about a month.
Amen. If your health IQ was a couple of points higher than it was a few minutes ago, go ahead and like this video or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And to take it even higher, head over to Apple Podcast or wherever you get your favorite shows. Look for The Exam Room by the Physicians Committee. Hit the subscribe button there as well and help to make your world a healthier place.